I have a brief question. I have a yes/no question for Elizabeth May and another question for Ezra. Thank you both. Ms. May, you talked about an energy program. I think one of the program, my background is in minerals. My question is, a yes or no, do you support the building of more refineries in Canada and a pipeline from Alberta to Halifax? Because that will have an environmental impact. Minimum, but it would have an environmental impact.
It would have, well, the environmental impact, yes, it would, but it's still important to have a national plan that does those things and make sure that they're going through proper environmental screening, cited and built properly.
But you would support?
Yeah.
Okay.
We need a national infrastructure. We also need an east-west electricity grid, okay, which we don't have.
My question to you, Ezra, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, they can really throw a club. The United States has to kowtow to them all the time. With Canada being such a big importer, why don't we have the respect in Washington? Why can't we sort of threaten the oil? I've never understood how Saudi can get away with a heck of a lot, and we have to be nice to them, but Canada's not really respecting the United States.
That's an excellent question. An economist's term is monopsony. A monopoly is when you have one guy selling, a bunch of people buying. Monopsony is when you have 100 oil sands companies all selling to one buyer, and you can be taken advantage of. If we were to build a pipeline to Kitimat, BC, 500,000 barrels a day is what Enbridge is proposing, to sell to India, Japan, Korea, even to China if you like, all of a sudden, I think Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama have to treat us with a little more respect, and we'd actually get a little bit more on the world market for our oil. But I think your first question was more amazing. You have just got the leader of the Green Party to endorse building more refineries and an enormous pipeline across this country. Good for you! Good for you! I might vote green.
Hi, thank you both for coming. It was a very stimulating debate. Elizabeth, you pointed out that 54% of our oil is imported. A lot of this happens because we are obligated under the North American Free Trade Agreement to supply the U.S. a certain percentage of their used oil. Mm-hmm. This free trade agreement was signed by Brian Mulroney. You were Brian Mulroney's environmental advisor, and he won the Most Environmental Prime Minister Award by the Sierra Club, and you were the executive founding director of the Sierra Club. So I want you to square that circle, please. Thank you.
First of all, the award was not from the Sierra Club. It was from an organization called Corporate Knights. I was on a jury. And frankly, when you look at the record of the Mulroney government on the environment, none of the other federal governments we've had before or since come close to the number of environmental accomplishments. I could rhyme them off for you, but we'd run out of time. They include the Ozone Protocol. They include putting climate change on the map and being a country that was prepared to take action on greenhouse gases. I was not Mulroney's assistant or advisor. I worked in the Office of the Minister of Environment, where we tried to find out what was going on in the negotiation of NAFTA, and were told, not so politely by the trade officials, to mind our own business. I tried to find out on behalf of the minister, because we wanted to know, would water be affected? Because at the same time that NAFTA was being negotiated, we were putting forward a federal water policy, which is still the only water policy in this country. It's excellent. It went through cabinet in 1987. It's never been implemented, and it calls for a federal ban on the export of water from this country, which remains a risk because of the way NAFTA was written.
You know, it's very unlike me to want to defend Elizabeth, especially against a fellow with a W cap. But, you know, I've heard that urban legend about the free trade agreement so many times, I actually went and I read the treaty. And what our Canada-U.S. free trade agreement says is not that we cannot sell our oil to others. Not that we do. We sell 100% of our exports to the States because we don't have a pipeline to the coast going outward bound. It says that we cannot pass a law denying or depriving America of their proportion. Now, that doesn't mean that companies can't willingly sell to China if we get a pipeline. It just means the Canadian government may not order industry, may not pass a law or a regulation reducing the proportion of oil America gets. But companies can sell it to whomever they like. The problem right now, as was asked by that other gentleman, is that we don't have any pipes going to the coast.
Okay.
Yes, Ezra, you've spoken about the morality of oil, and I wondered how you would rationalize Canadian oil being more morally whatever perspective you're looking at as far as classification of morality, violent and oppressive regimes invest in Canadian oil. So how is it that our oil is more moral than an oil that the Canadians would invest in, say, in Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's those four values I talk about. Environmentalism. We have the highest standards in the world. I agree we should always be improving, by the way. Peace. I mean, look how we live. Fair wages and human rights. There's nothing different in the octane or how it burns. It's the provenance. It's just, when I first heard the phrase fair trade coffee, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought, what are they talking about? It was such a stunning idea, but then I instantly got it. The way they went about it. And that's what I'm saying. In my book, I try and measure ethics. How do you put a number on ethics? Pounds of CO2 per barrel of oil, that's one way. I tried other ways. I measured the amount of blood per barrel of oil in Sudan. I took 300,000 people murdered in Darfur, according to the UN, times 185 ounces of blood per human body, divided into the number of barrels of oil exported the same period of time, according to the Energy Agency. It works out to 6.5 milliliters of blood, or, what's this? About 2 of these, 2 lip balms and in every barrel. We're morally superior in that, sorry.
But my point is that violent and oppressive regimes are both investing in Canadian oil and foreign oil. We invest in foreign oil.
Right.
Violent and oppressive regimes invest. So how is it? Who makes the lion's share of the money?
Well, none of those
Is it the investors or us?
Saudi Aramco and the Iranian National Company, and those guys are not in the oil sands. PetroChina has a small stake, but PetroChina must operate in Canada under Canadian rules. That's the good news. In fact, hopefully, we can make the pipe go backwards and sort of using our own regulations and business laws and shareholder accountability, push our ethics into PetroChina if they're operating here. It's a hope, it's idealism, but even if we can't, the way they do business in Fort McMurray is morally superior to the way they do business around the world.
I really do find that, it's a clever public relations ploy in the absence of an argument that we hear here. It's not relevant, to say that we produce things better in Canada. Of course we do. We're a country, like many around the world, that has respect for human rights, that has effective trade unions, that sets prices for wages. We're competing against cheap exports every time you turn around. You realize how hard it is to find something manufactured in Canada. Looking at the point of purchase labels and where things are built and where they're made, are hollowing out of our manufacturing sector and seeing jobs shipped offshore to produce in other countries. These are all serious questions for us. But if you're really serious about the moral production of oil, perhaps, Ezra, you should have a new policy for Canada, that we will have a clean hands policy, and we won't let any oil company develop the tar sands unless they can show us that they haven't been supporting despots, supporting military regimes that wipe out people who protest and indigenous peoples around the world. Let's have a clean hand policy and get Shell Oil and BP and Imperial Oil out of the tar sands. There'll be nobody left because the oil industry is soaked in blood everywhere you look.
China fails my 4 criteria pretty bad. Terrible on the environment, terrible on peace, terrible on fair wages, terrible on human rights. They're awful. Despite that, I would rather that awful regime buy their oil from us than from Iran or from Sudan, which they've turned into their little colony. So even dealing with an awful dictatorship like China is morally superior than having them prop up Iran and Sudan. You could call it the lesser of two evils, and that's my point, is that oil is us, the good guys, versus the OPEC bad guys. And I wish we could be comparing ourselves against Switzerland, but they're not a major OPEC exporter. They're just not. I wish they were.
Well, let's convert ourselves from a fossil fuel energy paradigm to an energy picture. And then we can be talking about how we do business with people, like buying more solar panels from Germany. Frankly, we should be making them here.
What's going to go in those
cars? We should be making our
cars?
solar panels here. And before you scoff, there's a wonderful company called Arise Solar that came out of Kitchener-Waterloo that was about to go on the stock exchange in Toronto. Really good, effective photovoltaic roofing panels so that homes, even in Canada, could get all their electricity from the solar that hits their roof. But instead of having this company built in Canada, the Germans came and poached them. The German government, which has an aggressive plan for renewable energy, picked up Arise Solar, offered them half the money it takes to build their plant, offered them $35 million to build in Dresden, Germany. And as a result, Canadian jobs ended up in Germany. This happens all the time. There are wind turbines we should be manufacturing here. There's solar panels we should be manufacturing here. And we should be hiring Canadian workers, tradesmen, carpenters, and electricians to retrofit the buildings in this country, because 30% of our greenhouse gases are from leaky buildings. We should be retrofitting. We should be employing people. It's a very aggressive agenda, and it's all about green jobs.
Okay, I think I'm next. I think I'm next.
I believe he's right.
I'm sorry.
It's not really my question, but I can't
do make
help.
it a question.
I can't help observing how insulting nonsense it is to say that the oil business is soaked in blood no matter where you go. That is nonsense. It's not soaked in blood here. But my main point is this. You really caught my attention, and I think all of our attention, and Mr. Levant also, emphasizing the huge imports of oil that we have from these bad countries and so on. And when you cut your way through all the baffle gab, I think that raises one basic question. Let's replace the imports from the oil sands. For goodness sake, what could be simpler?
Can I clarify? If I can clarify, my point was to Ezra, since he's created this new paradigm of moral arguments about the creation of oil, that we should be placing perhaps a test before multinationals come to Canada to make sure that they're also not investing and participating in the exploitation of oil in ways. For instance, Shell in Nigeria, not only did Shell exploit the Ogoni Delta for the oil, Shell executives sat down at the Nigerian High Commission in London before the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa to advise the Nigerian government how they could handle the public relations backlash for Abacha killing a critic of the oil development by Shell. There have been so many involvements of so many multinationals in so many stories that make your blood curl, make your blood boil, that I did not say that the blood is soaked in oil coming from the Athabasca tar sands. I said to try to find a company, a multinational, to exploit in the tar sands with a moral test. We want you to come here with clean hands. We want to know that you divest from Burma, you divest from China, you divest from the Sudan. You have nothing to do with Venezuela. You have nothing to do with Saudi Arabia. There's nobody left.
You know what? You're making my argument for me, aren't you? You're talking about the bad behavior in Nigeria. One of my other metrics in my book is I took $366 billion. That's the amount the Nigerian government itself calculates has been embezzled since 1960. Divided it into the number of barrels of oil exported over the same period of time. It's $18 a barrel of every barrel ever exported from Nigeria stolen and secreted in the Swiss bank. So you're so right that all those other places in the world are terrible. And I even would use the word blood-soaked. You're making my point that oil sands oil is morally superior if you care about those liberal values. But there's one thing I'm going to disagree with you on. Listen, I actually find myself agreeing with you more and more every time we talk. It may not sound that way. I mean, you talk about, hey, we got to wake up Atlantic Canada and Montreal that they're buying OPEC oil. I agree. I don't want to have a national command and control policy. You must buy oil sands oil, although I know some oil men who would like it. What I'd like to do is empower consumers to make choices. If we had country of origin labeling on our gas pumps, I think everyone in Montreal and Halifax and St. John's would say, hey, what the heck? I don't want to buy this Saudi oil. And they'd pressure their refiners to buy our ethical oil, and it would happen organically, naturally, freely, instead of command and control by a politician.
Listen, excuse me.
Thank you very much for a very illuminating debate. Mr. Levant, I take your point on the ethics of oil. Certainly some oil is more ethical than others. Mrs. May, I take your point on a national energy strategy. I see dialectic here, and I think we can come to a resolution. I see an Atlantic Canadian on stage, and I see a Westerner on stage. My question to both of you is, as a Torontonian, I know many of you will hate me as a result of that. As a Canadian, when I'm buying gas to put into my car, how do I make sure that it is ethical? Does it tie into a national energy strategy? And as a consumer, how am I empowered to make that choice?
you know, your shirt tells you where it's made. You don't need a national shirt strategy. You just need country of origin labeling. When you buy toys at Toys R Us, you don't need a national toy strategy. You just have country of origin labeling. It's a regulation. It's a little bit onerous, but you know, it's simple enough. And refineries, some refineries get oil from different sources. Fine, like an ingredients label. And you'd have some entrepreneurs saying, this oil certified 100% dictatorship free, or guaranteed no more than 5% terrorist oil in this tank.
But
you know,
are you not
just
are
like
you
fair
not,
trade coffee?
Are you not presupposing that that oil is available in Toronto?
Yeah.
Well, but you know what? You would create a demand for it. 1 million of your fellow Torontonians would cause refineries to say, oh my God, let's get rid of this Saudi stuff. And if it's Norwegian or UK oil, well, is that good enough for you?
Right. Number one, I mean, the fact of Nigerian government putting forward those figures is because it was the Abacha regime that stole the money, and it's a new government in Nigeria that's adding up how much was stolen. But they still haven't gotten to the heart of the problem. They haven't got the Niger Delta cleaned up. And, and I know it's not, the work on identifying Nigerian oil and getting city council after city council in solidarity with the Ogoni people to pass resolutions that the areas would not accept Nigerian crude has been the work of the environmental movement to raise this issue. What we're looking at now is our own responsibility to use less oil, to move off oil. It's not about which drug dealer do you go to, who has ethical cocaine. We have an addiction problem, and we have to move off oil. And that's the bottom line.
And I understand the arguments. I understand the arguments from both of you. My question was, when I fill up my car in Toronto, how do I make sure that the oil I'm putting in, the gas I'm putting in,
right
is
now
ethical?
You can't.
What
so
will it
take the bus.
We're taking walk. Listen, I'm not from around here, so maybe I don't understand how it all works, but I was very surprised, just like Mr. Levant, to hear you say that you support pipelines and refineries. Can you give a pledge to this audience now, and maybe it's been filmed, that you won't invent a double-breasted squirrel that has to be saved for some pipeline that is going here? And can you name me, and maybe see, in the rest of the world, environmental movement, green people oppose pipelines. Can you tell me some pipeline that the Green Party of Canada has supported ever in the past?
In terms of what we want as a national federal political party,
I'm looking for a name.
We want to see a plan for our energy use that doesn't rely on us as an exporting country, still importing 54% of our oil with no solution for those in Eastern Canada. Yeah. It's not a new position I'm taking today. We have supported a strategic petroleum reserve, and the whole question of pipelines is to make sure they are sited properly and not in greenfield areas. If you look at the existing pipelines in this country, now Enbridge already had a pipeline that we all know about because it broke in the Kalamazoo River. The pipeline from the tar sands to southern Canada already exists. Pipelines across Canada already exist in industrialized areas. I'm not supporting any brand new pipeline. We oppose the idea of an Enbridge pipeline to Kitimat because it crosses over an entire region that is in greenfield condition. It is not industrialized, and the 14 First Nations along that pipeline route oppose that pipeline. So understand what we're saying. We want to see a strategy for Canada so that we're not importing more oil than we export. That's pretty straightforward for energy sovereignty. As a national leader, we want to have a policy that works for all Canadians. We want to stop and slow down development of the tar sands so that the rest of the country's economy can catch up.
You haven't answered my question. You haven't answered my question. What pipeline will you support, or have you ever supported? You said you support this pipeline. When someone suggests building a pipeline, you'll invent a double-breasted owl or squirrel. Two-feathered whatever. I mean, tell me a name of a pipeline you supported in the past.
Personally, because I don't know when.
No, Green movement.
I've been the leader of the Green Party of Canada for 4.5 years. 17 years as executive director of Sierra Club of Canada. We supported the development of the pipeline from Sable Island through to Nova Scotia to New Brunswick and into New England. We did try to stop it long enough so that some of the natural gas could come into the Maritimes so we could use it. But we lost that. It all goes to the States. Okay, Ezra.
I agree with the skeptics that, today it's easy to say for Elizabeth that she would support a pipeline. I'm more skeptical that would happen in reality. But you've said a few things that caught my ear. You talked about Canada creating a strategic petroleum reserve. The United States did that because they're a net importer. They import, 10 million barrels a day. I can't remember the exact number. So if something went wrong, they'd have to have that resource. We are a net exporter. We have 1.7 trillion barrels in place in the oil sands, 170 billion of which are recoverable using current technologies. That's our strategic petroleum reserve. We don't need to put it in a well because it's there. We're a net export. It makes no sense.
How would we get it to the people who need it in Atlantic Canada if OPEC shut off the pipeline? There's no way to do it.
Hi. I'm glad to see that Mr. Levant has such a great plan for labeling oil in this country, which would really mean that east of Manitoba, nobody would have oil in this country. When we speak of human rights in this country, I guess you're forgetting to look at the record that we have, and you haven't lived on a reserve in this country. My question is about tailings ponds, and we might be able to laugh at the ducks that have been killed in this country, but what about the health impacts and the environmental impacts that these tailing ponds all across the country, not just in the oil sands, have on people and the environment?
It's an incredibly important question. Last weekend in Calgary, I met Dr. John O'Connor. Has anyone heard of Dr. John O'Connor? Big heart, small man with a big heart. He went out to Fort Chippewa, a town of about 1,100 souls, mainly Aboriginal, downstream from the oil sands. And Dr. O'Connor's own dad died of a rare form of cancer called cholangiocarcinoma. And wouldn't you know it, this is a cancer like 1 in 100,000 people gets it. And one of his patients gets it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 patients out of a town of 1,200 gets this extremely rare cancer. He panics. He goes on the CBC radio and shouts it to the world, "We're being poisoned." Documentary camera crew comes up, does a whole movie called Downstream. Thousands of hits on newspapers. Google it. Google O'Connor and cholangiocarcinoma. Well, by the time when the health department contacted them and said, "Oh my God, turn over their files," they encountered something strange. He wouldn't give over his patient files, even though it was required by law. His nurse begged him to. "Come on, doctor, give the files to the health region." He wouldn't. Well, when they finally got his records and other doctors examined it, there weren't 6 cases of cancer. There weren't 5. There weren't 4. There weren't 3. There were 2 cases of cholangiocarcinoma. And Alberta Health did a massive study, peer-reviewed. They even had someone from Fort Chip on the peer review committee saying that cancer rates in Fort Chip were not outside the range of normal. But by the time truth got its boots laced up, Dr. O'Connor's lie had been around the world for 2 years, and the College of Physicians and Surgeons, not politicians, not bureaucrats, but his fellow doctors had a disciplinary hearing, and they ruled that he had been unethically raising the alarm, unethically obstructing the investigation. The man whose heart was so big, who cared so much for his community, when it was time to prove and help them, lied.
I have to defend Dr. John O'Connor.
There, and those will be the only questions that we'll be taking. Okay. Then Elizabeth and Ezra will make final statements, but Elizabeth is having to respond to this.
Yeah, Dr. John O'Connor did not lie. Dr. John O'Connor is a fine human being and a good person, and he had never withheld any information. His side of the story, which Ezra Levant attacks him in this book, but Ezra never bothered to call him to get his side of the story. I did. And Dr. O'Connor reports that when he found out after the fact, Health Canada says they sent him an email. He went searching for it. The nursing staff went looking for it. They didn't have an email from Health Canada. The chief nurse in charge, Georgianne MacDonald, tried to get a response out of Health Canada, had all the information ready for them. There's 2 sides to this story in terms of what information was provided and when. In fact, not 2 cases of bile duct cancer, but 5 cases were confirmed. 2 of them were the rarer cholangiocarcinoma, but in your book, Ezra, you've confused bile duct cancer in general with this one rarer type. There were 2 of the cholangiocarcinoma. There were 5 bile duct cancers altogether. And unlike the claim that you make in your book that this type of cancer is more common as a genetic fact. For Aboriginal peoples, that's not true. They happen to have more of this cancer, and it requires further investigation. And Dr. John O'Connor was not found to have behaved unethically. As a visiting physician, as he pointed out to me, as a visiting physician to this region, he could no more have obstructed access to data that he could have dictated working hours for nurses that he visited when he was there to visit in the community. He does regret one thing. He said he had diagnosed the cancers. He should have said he suspected them because he didn't have the clinical capacity in that remote location to do diagnosis.
My question is for Ms. May. I'm wanting to bring the debate back to the employment issues. I'm from Duncan on Vancouver Island, which is a really small community. Our unemployment rate is quite a bit higher than the national average. And I grew up with my father being gone a lot in logging camps because the wage was higher. He eventually chose to start a small business, which was, of course, a substantially lower wage, but it meant being at home with the kids. I'm wondering what the Green Party proposes to ensure that there are jobs in the small communities as opposed to having to leave to northern BC or Fort McMurray or wherever else.
Yeah, thank you. We have... There are a number of aspects to the question. One is to have the right kind of dollar policies so that we can have jobs that are export related. For instance, in the pulp and paper industry, we need more value added as a key. This is why I object to crude leaving the country without being refined. On the same basis, the Green Party objects to raw log exports. We need to take our resources and have value added. If you compare our forest industry to Sweden's, for example, Sweden, we have roughly, we both rely on forest exports, but the Canadian economy has been geared to high quantity, low value exports. Sweden did the reverse. Lower quantity of forest logged for a higher value export because of more value added. The policies involve changes to the fiscal system. We right now have a tax system that rewards companies in fiscal terms. The bottom line is improved if you have fewer employees. But if you're using more natural resources and more energy, there's no impact. As a matter of fact, that's a good way to be more productive. We need to do for energy productivity and resource use productivity what we did for labor productivity in the past. Additional tax policies to help involves help for small business, income splitting so that families who are starting up a small business and someone staying home can get the benefit of that in their taxes. There's a range of programs. It's not a simple thing, but the point is a government has to set a goal. And the goal has to be, we want to help people create jobs in local communities because small business, local jobs, and resilient communities are our goal.
Thank you very much.
A couple times now, Elizabeth talks about not exporting the raw material. We should upgrade it here in Canada. Well, I'm not an expert in upgraders, but I would imagine if there's profit to be made in upgrading the oil in Canada, we would do it. And if there's not, I'm not sure if I want government to get into that business to subsidize the oil industry by creating some crown corporation or however it would be done. But you also say that high currency hurts the economy. Well, I guess you could artificially lower the currency or have it low to subsidize artificially exports. But basically, that's just another way of saying give everyone a pay cut so that the cost of what you sell is lower. When you lower your currency, you'll get sales because you're actually selling it at a discount. And I'm not sure that that's a healthy thing for the economy. It reduces our standard of living, and everything that we import becomes more expensive. I don't think that kind of tinkering is a solution. Now, that's pretty far afield from the oil sands debate we're here to have, but I think it goes to some confusion on the Green Party when it comes to economics.
Earlier in the debate, you compared the ethics of oil to the ethics of child labor. Now, speaking as a kid who grew up really poor in Canada, who would have really appreciated a good job, ethical in Canada, I'm wondering how you can say that the ethics of oil are irrelevant to the debate of what you do in the oil sands.
Because we're talking about a Canadian resource and how Canada will handle it. Given that question, we know that there are certain things that just aren't going to occur in Canada. Thank God, we're not a country where people are going to be jailed or shot for their opinions. We're not a country where, as happened in Nigeria or happens in the Sudan, the money is diverted to Swiss bank accounts for military dictators. Therefore, saying we're so much better than the others isn't really relevant. The question for Canadians is, how do we handle this resource? What do we do globally to reduce carbon emissions? How do we ensure that the way we develop our energy is done in a way that creates more jobs across the country instead of fewer jobs in one place and more in another?
I think that you've said something very illiberal there. You said it's the ethic.
I'm not a liberal. I'm a green. You may be confused.
I don't mean illiberal in the partisan mean. I mean you said something that's not progressive. You said something that I think if you thought about you would realize it conflicts your deeply held views on human rights. This is my thinking. Because you said that the ethics of oil is irrelevant. No. Especially for a liberal, no. Because liberals believe in thinking globally and acting locally. Liberals don't believe in NIMBY, not in my backyard. And that's sort of what saying the ethics of oil isn't important means. Because I guess we could freeze the oil sands, a moratorium, like you say, but that's just sentencing people in Nigeria and Venezuela and Iran and Sudan and Saudi Arabia to the lives they have. If we want to improve the ethical character of the world's oil industry, we should produce more and take market share away from the bad guys and actually put pressure on refineries to buy ethical oil. And for you to say, well, that's not relevant, or as Greenpeace told me in a debate, we shouldn't be judgmental from Greenpeace. Could you imagine that? I don't believe that's what your heart is about, actually. I think you believe in ethics very much, Elizabeth.
Okay.
We got to wrap this up. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to let Elizabeth have 30 seconds, Ezra have 30 seconds. You ask a brief question. You ask a brief question.
Okay, because we had two things to catch up on. In response to this, how oil is produced in other countries is, of course, of concern to me. We talked earlier about the fact that we led efforts to stop Nigerian oil from being sold and to label that so people knew where it was coming from. But the way you deal with that is not to pump out more Athabasca crude with the excuse that we're so much better than the others. It's actually to use the leverage we have with, for instance, the World Bank and others to insist and have the technology transfer to stop the flaring in Nigeria, to clean up the mess left by Shell in the Agoni Delta. And instead, Canada uses our clout in the World Bank to do what? We've just recently voted to fund a 4,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant in South Africa. We can have an influence on those countries' oil production to clean it up, provide fairer labor, but just to use those examples to say that what we're doing is so perfect that there's no room for improvement is irrelevant. Fred's noticing time?
Yeah, it's the hall.
I've never said that we shouldn't improve. In fact, my favorite thing about the oil sands is that we always improve. But, you know, having protests, we've got sanctions on Sudan and Iran. You know, Americans aren't allowed to buy oil from those two countries. So what? They sell to China, India. Sanctions actually don't work in a country where China is an enormous consumer. The only thing that does work is taking market share away from there. Now, in a global demand of 85 million barrels a day, we can't take it all. But I'd rather the oil sands take a 5 million barrel a day chunk out of the dictatorship oil than just the 1.4 million a day chunk we take now. And every barrel we sell is a barrel the bad guys don't. And that is far more effective than your important meetings and your important press releases that have done nothing to stop Nigeria, Sudan, or Iran.
Can I just say quickly, though, I mean...
This is a question mostly for Elizabeth May. Before I go into it, I just want to make sure that I got what you said earlier. Right? You had a statement that you wanted to get rid of oil as much as possible. Is that true? You want to get rid of it completely?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, want to get rid of it completely over what kind of time frame? I want to be clear on this. We should be moving aggressively off oil. That's what the world economy should be doing. We should be moving off coal. We should be moving off fossil fuels.
Okay. My background is I'm an engineer, and I don't think anybody here on either side of the debate would say that green technology is a bad idea. I think nobody wants pollution. Nobody wants all these other bad things that happen. But my point is current technologies aren't that much better. In some respects, oil is some of the greenest technology we have because other technologies like like hybrid cars, they use rare earth elements that have to be mined.
Okay.
Sorry. My question was, how is it a logical statement that we need to get rid of oil?
Okay, you know what? We'll hold that thought.
Okay.
Hold that thought.
I'll be quick. I'm old school hot rod. I build hot rods. We've been building hot rods and fixing old motors to run more efficiently for years. We're under attack. Our way of life. I had to move out of Ottawa because I can't play with my cars. It's ridiculous. I don't talk to my brother anymore because I have a car that he thinks is environmentally unfriendly. I can't afford to buy a hybrid. Give me a car, give me a motor cheap that I can put in my Model A, and it'll be in there next week. I'll run it on water. I don't care. Get the governments to build the stuff that the working class can use.
You know, that's actually reality. 13.6 million cars sold in China last year. Sorry, they're not going to not use their car because some luxuriant Western liberal tells them not to. 1.4 billion people in the world still don't have electricity. Sorry, they're not going to stop electrifying because someone wants them to use recycled urine or whatever it is. And so all this talk about oil being evil, yeah, it's nice to say in a nice heated room where you jet around the country. That's just not real life for most people in the world. Even if every Canadian were to shut down, if you shut down the entire oil sands, China will make up that gap in 3 days. And so, to me, being morally serious is not having a science fiction fantasy debate about what fuel will be used in 40 years. Tidal power, geothermal. No, it's what is going in your gas tank tomorrow, because you've got to fill up tomorrow. And none of these pie-in-the-sky ideas are here yet. When they come, I will celebrate. But until that day, we've got to live in reality. And Americans are going to fill up. If it's not our oil, I know whose oil it will be. I don't have to be a prophet. I can look at history. It will be OPEC oil.
Okay. Okay. The notion that we tell anything important to anyone in terms of market share is made a nonsense by the World Energy Outlook report of the International Energy Agency. We're looking at a world that wants to move to likely scenarios, 36% increase in energy demand between 2008 and 2035. We're looking at a situation in which we need desperately to put in place carbon pricing, not just because of the climate crisis, which we have not addressed adequately today, but I certainly would welcome a chance to do that another time. The reality is also that without carbon pricing, this demand will outstrip supply so fast that economies will be put into a very significant crunch. Look up peak oil if you don't know why. The reason we're not, by the way, Ezra, refining the crude in Canada is not because you can't make money at it. It's because the unregulated, chaotic development in the Athabasca tar sands creates a hyperinflationary trend that's localized to Alberta that Peter Lougheed, the former premier, describes as the traffic jam. That's why they take the crude south of the border to develop the oil there. We have got to be sensible about this. The move off fossil fuels starts with conservation and energy efficiency improvements, which are not 40 years away. They're on the shelf now. We can make the jobs and stop wasting the energy we use.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. And can I have just a quick round of applause for both of these wonderful people?